as well as the story of the healing of the centurion's servant. In today's Wholeness interview, we're going to look at how you feeling unworthy has no connection to how God views you. Sharing their views and experience on this is Ronald and Dr. Melody Bacon, owners of Relationship Vision, Inc. in Southern California. Ronald is a licensed marriage and family therapist and, apart from a few years as a pastor, has worked in the treatment field during much of his professional life. He's an adjunct professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, where he teaches a class on spirituality and addictions. Dr. Melody Bacon is a clinical psychologist specializing in relationship issues and is also a professor of marriage and family therapy. She has authored books that focused on helping individuals after a divorce and helping families facing a loved one's addiction. Together, Ronald and Dr. Melody developed an online program designed to help families navigate the chaos of addiction and find serenity and peace. Welcome to Hope at Home, guys.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, you both counsel people through lots of issues, and particularly people who have suffered through addiction and through divorce. Is there any similarity between these two areas?
Certainly, that feelings of that I must have done something wrong, wanting to look back, try to change something. We tend to do that when there's any kind of crisis. We run backwards thinking, if I'd only done this or that, and we blame ourselves because we don't want the unacceptable result that we have. We think maybe if we just replay it, we'll get something different.
Yeah, and I also think that people feel like failures when something doesn't work out, particularly with their marriages, but also if a loved one, particularly a child, is struggling with substance use disorder. They wonder what they did wrong. And one thing I always point out is that Adam and Eve had the perfect parent.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, they made the decision to not follow God's one request. And so we can do the best we can, give our children the best we can, do the best we can with our marriages. But ultimately, someone may make the decision to either leave the marriage or to not go to counseling, to disregard some of the warning signs that a substance use disorder is, progressing. And it's very, very difficult then to be someone who loves someone who's made these poor decisions. Although I do think it must be very similar for God to be watching us do the same thing with our lives. It gives us a little bit of insight, however tiny that might be.
Yeah. There is a researcher called Brené Brown who researches guilt and shame. I'm sure you're familiar with her work. She says that we are the most addicted and most medicated generation in the history of humanity. And so these addictions run deep in various ways. And of course, I notice I'm the father of three, so I have three boys. And what I noticed about myself as I observe how I relate to them is that the things that make me the most upset when I observe their behavior are exactly the things that I've struggled with my whole life. And now I'm seeing this in my children. And that makes me, wonder. And there are some things I thought I had resolved way before they were born. How do the problems of one generation transfer to future ones?
Oh, boy. Good question.
It's interesting to read the Bible stories, particularly the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and see how the problems from one generation move into the next. That's just the way it works. I don't think God makes it that way. Right. We're created that way. And being able, perhaps maybe the real miracle is being able, one, to recognize it and then begin to do something different about it. And that's part of what we assist people in doing, is just saying, well, what's my part? What did I inherit? And what am I likely to do automatically? And how would I go about changing something that's so automatic? That's through prayer and the power of the Holy Spirit to make the changes. But I think God allows us, and that's in counseling, you can learn, or in your relationships, you start seeing parts of yourself you wouldn't see otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think that our own journey is intimately tied in our relationships, that we can't grow outside of them, because, you can get a pretty high opinion of yourself when you're not in a relationship with someone. So whether it's our children or our spouse, it's often easier to see things in them that they ought to be correcting. Not so easy to see our own, log in our own eye.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, as you noted, there are patterns that families pass on through the generations, some very good, some strengths,
Mm-hmm.
persevering
Mm-hmm.
and overcoming obstacles. So I always tell my clients it's as if you have an emotional inheritance. So you get to pick the strengths you want to continue in your life, and those that have been difficult for the generations past, and you're finding yourself doing the same now, you have the opportunity to change those so that your children and grandchildren and so forth have a slightly better inheritance, so to speak, and are able to navigate those more successfully.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's...
Yeah, it's really those things that we don't want to look at in ourselves, that's what we pass on to our kids. And they'll have to deal with it if we don't.
Right. Well, let's shift gears a little bit into substance abuse disorders. Mm-hmm. Why is it so difficult to treat things like alcoholism or other addictions in that realm?
Yeah. Part of it is that they have such power that they're inside a person, as it were, a craving, a desire is something inside a person's head. We see behaviors, but that's not the addiction. Some people, whether they drink something, they go to the doctor, they have a leg injury, for instance, they have an opiate. A lot of people say, I don't like this feeling, I don't want that. And there's others have a very different response. And that their response then creates this an obsession. Mm-hmm. And that's the part that's the addiction, the obsession part. And they can change their behaviors, they can keep themselves from doing it, and yet that obsession is there. Mm-hmm. That's what God does. God removes the obsession, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. Mm-hmm. And when somebody gets this sometimes slowly, they feel like God isn't listening to them.
Yeah. It's pretty well established that addiction is a disease very similar to diabetes or hypertension, that we don't choose to get these things, but we do have to manage them. And we don't know who's going to be predisposed to being an addict. Most people, as Ron noted, can take an opiate after like a surgery. They kind of like are done with it and they forget about it. The vast majority of people, that's the experience. And we can't tell ahead of time who will take the one little Vicodin and boom, off they go. Or a drink of alcohol. Vast majority of people, it's just alcohol to them. But to an addict, it eventually gets to be very similar in terms of the way the brain interprets the need for it, as though it were water. So imagine how thirsty you can get, and if you really don't get it, you will die. That's the experience of someone with an addiction for their drug of choice. Very hard for those of us who've been blessed to not have that struggle. And as Ron noted, we're very big supporters of the 12-step movement to support this, because they understand that the only thing that will take away that obsession is God, your higher power. Why they say higher power is because the power they already have in their life, their substance, is running their life already. They need, and it's not a benign, loving substance. It's only after their destruction. So the only thing to counteract that is a higher power, which is God, and to turn yourself over to God. As Ron said, eventually the obsession can be lifted, sometimes right away. Most of the time, as with most of the healing we get in our lives, it doesn't happen that way. It's more of a kind of a process. Yeah.
And God doesn't take orders from us. No. I want this obsession lifted now. God doesn't do that. And he allows sometimes the struggle, the wrestling that Jacob had in the wilderness. At any moment, marauder is what it felt like. He didn't know who it was. The stranger had him. And once he realized this is supernatural and grabbed his ankle and said, I'm not letting you go until you bless me, that at any time during that night of wrestling, that being, which I believe was Jesus himself, said, he could have said, I'm on your side. I'm here to help you. I'm here to bless you. He didn't. He let him struggle, and it was difficult.
Yeah. Now, what often starts as a symbol or as an action of freedom, come and have a drink, they said.
Yes.
It will be fun, they said. And there, it starts as this moment of freedom, especially as a teenager. You're going through lots of problems, and then your friends invite you just to take a hit or to take a drink, and you experience this dopamine, and it's so great. Now I am free. Down the road, you become an absolute slave to that substance. And it can be devastating if you have a loved one who's an addict. And most of us have a family member who is in that situation. Do you have any suggestions of how friends and family of addicts can cope? Because in my family, I've got one side of the family and that just wants to beat it out of them. And of course, that's never helpful. It never works. And then you have the other side of the family that has other suggestions and ideas about how to solve it. Now, this is what you guys do. How can you offer some practical ways that loved ones can react in this situation?
Yeah. Part of what we do is help people know the difference between what is abstinence and what is sobriety. Sobriety is rigorous honesty in everything a person does. Abstinence is going through the motions, is certainly a prerequisite to sobriety. And, so being able to look at that, how would a family support sobriety? That the disease of addiction is all about denial and minimization, and people will, as long as they've got their job and they're earning money, it's pretty much, quit bothering me. You're making things up. It's not, and so we do recommend that family members do focus on themselves. That's in keeping with what Melody had alluded to, that work on the log in your own eye. And yet you don't start, I'm not going to lie for you. I'm not going to say things that aren't true. If this is a spouse, if it's a kid, especially one that's under 18.
After on to treatment.
This is what you're going to do. If it's somebody who's over 18, I'm not paying car payments. I'm not doing that. I can help in other ways that are going to be supportive of sobriety.
Yeah, knowing what you're going to invest in. I think that we like to think about the person. Let's say it's a parent, and they have an adult child, so now they're not able to force them to go into treatment. There is a myth out there that people who are forced to go to treatment don't do well in treatment, which is completely wrong. Actually, people who are mandated to treatment do just as well, as if not better. So I always tell parents of minor children, if their child has an addiction, don't think they'll outgrow it. Have them go into a treatment. But I also think that they need to do their own. They need to take leadership. What tends to happen is they see the child or the spouse as the problem. I don't have the problem, and I've heard this before. I'll suggest, I like the family 12-step groups like Al-Anon, for example, for spouses, and also parents. For Nar-Anon is another one for parents of narcotics users. And I'll often hear, well, why should I go to a 12-step? In fact, one woman said, why should I be punished? I'm not the one with the alcoholism. But you are the person that's more capable of making changes than the person struggling with the addiction. And you can also learn, again, some very good spiritual steps to take as, the person who maybe eventually will get into sobriety and work a program of 12-step. You start with the acknowledgement that you are powerless over this and that you need to turn this over to God. And but then there are also things you need to do. You need to get right with people. You need to make amends for things that you've done that have been hurtful. Those are all good principles, very much in keeping with, the Christian faith. And not to say, I don't have a problem, go get yourself healed or get yourself treated and then come back to us. But rather to say, gee, what am I doing? What can I do differently? I can go to Al-Anon or Nar-Anon. I can learn how to make good decisions. If my adult child calls and is out on the streets because they've been using drugs and they want me to give them money, my response would be, I'm not investing in your continued addiction, but I'll definitely drive you to a treatment center. I had a client, for example, her brother was in that situation, and she had called the Salvation Army, who has an amazing substance use treatment, and found that they had a bed available. And she said, I'm not willing to give you money or have you move in with me, but I will drive you to the Salvation Army and help you get there. He declined for about 6 months until he finally said, okay. And, it ended up working very well, because had she said, oh, I feel bad for him, I'm going to have him move in, he wouldn't have left, number one. He would have been using, and neither of them would have benefited.
Right.
It would have been
I think that it's loving, but staying connected. You hear this term tough love, which nobody knows what that means. Cutting off someone you love doesn't give them the opportunity to have you as a resource. So I always say you want to be the first person they go to. And so I think that's, part of the idea of staying connected to someone, even if they're using, but not co-signing their addiction.
Right. Yeah. We have had parents who, when one child gets sick, that it's as though they don't have any other kids. Their thoughts are entirely captured by this one who is struggling. And how to have balance is really part of how we define what is health, is living in balance, everything in balance. And so this imbalance of being so focused on the other that that's an obsession of a different kind. It's not a drug, it's a relationship obsession. And we can't change that. How do you change your aching parent heart on your own? And so something that otherwise would be bad or evil or however we want to describe it drives us closer to our God, who is the only one that can help us with that. And even when we're already believers, it helps us get closer. We'll never be as close to God as what eternity will give us. Yeah. There's always room for greater growth and more closeness with God.
Ronald and Dr. Melody, thank you so much for your insights and your encouragement that you've shared with us today. If you, our viewer, has been encouraged or have your own takeaways from this interview, be sure to share your thoughts with the rest of our Hope at Hope family. And you can do this on our Facebook page or our YouTube page too, or on our website, hopetv.org/at-home. As promised,